Well, good to see you again, Richard.
It's great to be here, Morgan. Thanks for having me back to chat to.
Yeah, no problem. It was really enjoyable event, and we had lots of great feedback from it, and people wanting to hear more from the speakers. And I think always kind of a danger with these events is that they're a flash in the pan, and people hear a little snippet. So we thought we wanted to do some longer conversations with the people who are involved, just to dig a bit deeper, really, into what was said. And I think Natasha, who did the presentation on, when was it, last Tuesday, she's going to interview Emma Seppeler pretty soon, so that'll be great. But yeah, it's great to be able to chat to you some more.
It's a pleasure. And by the way, the panel you assembled, what an incredible group of people, inspiring. And I think what was really interesting for me was we were a group of people, most of whom came from slightly different fields and different disciplines and areas of expertise, but the commonality was extraordinary. The common themes, and I think that's quite a lesson, really, in all of this, is that one of the biggest problems, I think, with perception across the board, actually, is that we all perceive that the problems we're facing or that we identify or that we're dealing with are somehow unique. They're unique to us, our place, our time, our professional capacity, our personal circumstances. And I think almost instinctively, sadly, we end up siloing ourselves, not because we want to be selfish and we don't want to share or to collaborate, but because we simply believe that what we're dealing with in our place and time is unique. And it's weird because I think events like the other night illustrate 5 people, 6 people who had never met before, who came from significantly different fields and places around the world. Basically, we're all going, I agree.
Yeah, perhaps there wasn't enough. I disagree, was it, for it to be a discussion?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. In a way, I think it is just one of those important issues. If we dug deeper on the night and talked about, okay, so how do we activate this? There may have been some disagreement, but it would have been constructive disagreement, and it would have been founded on just. And then, because of the maturity of the conversation and the group of people, again, for me, a really great illustration of how to do it. What would have happened is we would have come to a consensus. We wouldn't have been polarized. And I think, sadly, all too often, when we look at what's going on in the media, and when our kids are seeing what's happening in the media, whether it's social media or traditional media, right, the instinct almost is we have to create polarization to create entertainment and interest. And I think that's a real danger because our kids see that all the time. Yet actually in the real world, really mature, sensible conversations where people come together around a common cause or a common sense of purpose will usually arrive in a very undramatic way at a kind of positive consensus. And in a way, we need to show and illustrate that more often to young people, and actually not just to young people. We need to, that for me is at the heart of compassion. It's not about blind agreement or, we all think the same thing. It's about the ability to realize that actually, if we come together around a common cause, which is humanity, even if it's as selfish as our survival, right, as a species, we can find frameworks to come together and find active solutions. And that's true of whether we're dealing with ethnicity or economics or environmental issues or whatever else it might be. Yet the danger is, because of the consumerist way in which our information is portrayed across various platforms, too often we see the polarizing rather than the commonality.
Yeah, and we think that's certainly one of the things which is causing the values perception gap, in that because we're getting a sense from, the kind of the filter through which society comes to us has all this kind of polarization and let's create debate and let's have arguments and showing people up against each other. Then it brings out the worst in people. The media deliberately brings out the worst in people because that's entertaining, and that's true kind of social media and the news, but you also see it in TV dramas and comedies, and it's kind of reinforced there as well in a much sort of subtler way, even in adverts as well. So you can see.
Yeah, and it's a shame because actually what it does is it inhibits nuance, and nuance actually is often where solutions are found, right? Because, allowing yourself, the problem is if our instinct is, if you don't agree with me, or if you're seeing something in a slightly different track, then we must be against each other. There's no space for nuance to occur, for exploration and discovery, and for molding and just finding little sparks of connection. And in some ways, that's where we need we need ourselves to inhabit that space, and we need to encourage our children to inhabit that space too. Because I think in a way that's one of the things I find saddest. We've almost seen a death of nuance in the last couple of decades. And somehow we've got to find a way back to it. And you're right, it may not write the headline on a tabloid newspaper, but actually it's what defines us as human beings. Before we started recording, I was talking about a friend of mine, Sebastian Foucault, who we won't go into the story now, but he's very cool, very groovy. Look him up on YouTube. He does parkour and leaping off big buildings and all that kind of stuff. But I remember when I was interviewing him recently for some work I was doing, and we talked about superpowers, superhuman powers. Because in some ways, people, if you watch what Seb's capable of, leaping on, also, it's like a superpower, right? It's like something from the Avengers. And actually, he turned around to me. He said, Richard, there is only one human superpower, and it's the use of a question mark. And I just thought, oh my God, that's brilliant, isn't it?
That is very cool. In the curiosity, I'm guessing he was trying to get out there and
exactly
what's possible, and it's maybe one of the things which you can either choose to nurture it or to kind of dampen it down a bit when you're a teacher.
I mean, it's that thing, isn't it? It comes again down to one of the key elements of the report, actually, and this idea that so many young people feel passionate about stuff, but actually feel they have no route to activism. And in many ways, that's exactly the point. They're dampening or somehow their curiosity is being dampened because they're curious enough to go, oh my goodness me, that really interests me. That's something I could be passionate about. But then in the next reflex, they go, but. So there's no question mark. And that's the point. It's about actually encouraging our young people to say, I find that really interesting or really disturbing or really serious or something that I'm really passionate about. How do I get involved? And in a way, that's the ladder, right? That's the bit we've all got to find a way to encourage, whether it's in mainstream education or any other facet of life where we're working with young people. We have to encourage the question mark rather than the full stop.
Yeah, definitely. I was listening to do you listen to the Adam Buxton podcast at all?
No.
So I was listening to that. He interviews all sorts of actors and singers and writers and things. He was talking to Caitlin Moran.
Oh gosh, she's brilliant.
Yeah, it was great. And she was homeschooled, and she was talking about her experiences of being homeschooled and how that developed her kind of natural curiosity. And she was saying that in the lockdown now, and her children are in that situation, she wouldn't choose to put her children into homeschooling, but she was seeing that after the first couple of weeks where they were a bit bored and a bit tired of doing schoolwork, the more that she left them alone, and she was reflecting back on how it felt for her as well when she was a kid, the more that, the curiosity just happened then. It was kind of like the longer that her parents had left her to kind of like to her own devices, eventually she'd be like, I want to find out more about this. And that's when the curiosity kicked in, and that's when the learning really kicked in, and she really found the stuff she was really interested in.
It's really interesting. I mean, I've been describing it since lockdown 1 as an opportunity to free range our brains. And it is really interesting because in so many ways, society, which is still pretty much predicated on training people to live inside an industrial age, right, is predicated on a pursuit of efficiency and a pursuit of routine cognition and all of those very traditional factors about get your head down and learn to do what you're told as efficiently and as productively as you possibly can. And at the end of that particular rainbow lies a pot of gold, which is security and safety, right? And so in many ways, we're all raised that way, whether it's accidentally in our home environments, whether it's in our school and academic environments, even when we're being managed in our jobs. So much of our lives are about hyper control. And many ways, we've got to a point almost as a species, where if we don't have that certainty and we don't have that factor of something or somebody controlling the main areas of our lives, we become deeply insecure. And then what we do is we look to fill it with control. And to an extent, that has happened to an extent with our children and homeschooling, by the way, I get it, because there are two very different sides to homeschooling. There are those homes where children are getting access to books and resources and stimulation, and parents who have the time or capacity to communicate with them, versus those children who really have very limited access to any form of stimulation. So I'm very conscious of that, right? But at the same time, what our instinct is, we've got to fill our children's time. We've got to hyper manage them and hyper control them. Because if we don't, I'm a bad parent, or I'm not doing my job properly, or my goodness me, they're going to get bored, or I've got to keep them busy, or I've got to keep them focused. And actually, to an extent, it is a product of our own making. And you're right, when you allow a child space and time to... And obviously, they're in an environment where they have access to being stimulated.
Yeah.
It might take a while, but you will still see children start to free range their brains a little bit, right? They become interested in stuff. They become self-managing, self-leading. If you look at our very youngest kids in school nurseries and in foundation units, they pretty much manage their own time, right? They're not hyper-controlled. They're not sat behind desks 6 hours a day, right? They're given a project or a task or a problem and told to go and solve it, mostly collaboratively. Yet as we get older, we start to go the other way. And so there is absolutely, inevitably a struggle, I think. And it's one, by the way, that's really come home to roost over this last year, because certainty has been ripped away from nearly all of us. And one of the reasons so many of us are finding it so profoundly difficult to deal with on a mental and emotional level is because what we want are as many levers of control back in our lives as we can possibly have, because that's how we've been raised. And in a way, that's partly the problem. So, for example, it's like, if you take, for example, the concerns young people or even our generation and older have around things like the environment, in a way, the first reflex is one of that's awful, but then we go into denial, most of us. Oh, well, it won't happen. It's not really, the scientists don't really know what they're going to do. They're all being a bit over dramatic about this, aren't they? It'll happen in 5,000 years' time when we're all dead and gone anyway, right? And what's really interesting, in a way, is that if somebody had said to us, well, they did, didn't they? 5 or 10 years ago, there will be a global pandemic that will impact the entire planet. Even our policymakers were going, yeah, be all right, be okay, be all right, but we'll deal with it.
They were doing that five weeks before, weren't they?
Well, yeah, well, some of them are even doing it now, Morgan, right? But the point is that actually the shared experience of the last year has called into really sharp focus that actually this stuff can happen. And it can happen if we don't do something about it. So my instinct is we are learning the hard way, but at the same time, as we come through this, and there will be many challenges to young people, I think they're going to be the most active generation of activists the world's seen in many, many decades.
You could well be right. And I think, if we don't do something about it, then we will get more calamities. And I think it's because of the way, the lives we've been living, I guess, and the structures we have in place and the inequalities and so on. They're kind of, it's all bubbling up, isn't it, under the surface, and there will be calamities.
Yeah. And the veneer of a pursuit of certainty and the ability to deny are gone, right? Because, whenever we've seen a tsunami, it's awful, but it's somebody else's problem. If ever we've seen bushfires, it's awful, but it's somebody else's problem. All of a sudden, we've all had to cope with a global disaster. And I think that's going to change the way, hopefully, we start to realize our place as a tiny speck in the ecosystem of things. And I think it'll have a profound impact on our kids. And it's why, by the way, we've got to find ways to close the values perception gap. Because what we've now got potentially is an incredible generation of young people who really could change the world and feel more, I think, convinced that they need to. And now we need to help them find ways to do it. So actually they galvanize that belief into action.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think totally agree. And think, yeah, that would be kind of the next thing I'd like to sort of ask you about is in a school, rather than thinking about sort of what's wrong with schools, I'd love to sort of hear from you about, I mean, Alison talked about Alison Creel on the talk last week.
Amazing school leader. She's an amazing person.
Incredible. And she sort of talked about her frustration about how the school system tends to sort of teach compassion out of children rather than kind of nurturing it. And I just wanted to, just to talk really from your experience of when you were a teacher, but also obviously you've met loads of brilliant people over the years. How are they going about, how are they kind of creating that curiosity in school, compassion, creativity, care for others, that, how are they breaking down that values perception gap in their school? Or probably not even letting it open, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is it's not an either or. It's not like, the thing is that I think 99.9% of educators passionately care about their students and passionately want to empower them and engender them with the skills, knowledge, confidence, attributes in order to make a real difference, not only to their own lives, but the lives of those around them. So that's the really important thing to say. I think often schools aren't struggling with this because of either a lack of desire or even a lack of ability within the school community. But I think there are extraordinary pressures that have come to bear more than ever in the last decade on our schools to focus specifically on very fixed outcomes. And as a result, the discourse, the training, the development has almost exclusively centered around this pursuit of efficiency. How do we teach better, not in terms of a 360 dimension, but in order to achieve better results? How do we do that more efficiently and effectively to get higher scores and higher grades? And so what's happened, I think, to an extent, is a lot of schools and a lot of teachers have felt under intense pressure to push stuff aside in the belief that, well, if we can get the scores and the results and the qualifications, then maybe we can bring the rest back in later. So it's almost seen, sometimes as a luxury commodity, a luxury item. And the truth is, it isn't. And in the best schools, first of all, what you see is a huge confidence in the leadership of that school to know that it's not either or, but actually all of these things are interconnected, and students will always perform better if they're given those rounded experiences and that rounded connection to the world. There's plenty of research out there from the Education Endowment Foundation, a whole range of other people, that says actually the more rounded a child's experience, the better they do academically. Unfortunately, because of the culture, too many schools have closed down rather than opened up. And I think it's a universal truth that the schools that are performing the best are the ones that have the courage of their convictions and actually say, no, we understand that the more our kids have, the better they perform, the more they thrive. And as a result, what you see are schools that are much more wedded to a pursuit of curriculum that really develop experiences and context for kids, so that things don't feel abstracted, don't feel like they're just jumping through hoops because they've been told they've got to jump through hoops. And actually what then happens is that learning becomes far more successfully applied in a lifelong journey, because those young people start to see the interconnection between the knowledge and skills they're learning in school and how it can impact as future citizens. Right. Yeah. And I think that commitment to raising a sense of aspiration and a sense of personal place and value, when it's front and center in a school, makes a profound difference. But there is a real challenge here of leadership. We require leaders in our schools to allow those cultures to permeate and develop. And go back to what I said at the start. It's not because of a lack of capacity or ability. It's quite the opposite. What we've got to do is take our feet off the potential and let it thrive and trust it. So great schools have trust, have confidence, have really good leaders, and they have an absolute commitment to the 360-degree development of young people.
Yeah, for sure. And that, I guess, is where project-based learning can fit in to that, in that it's tangible, it's especially when it's child-led and they can decide what they're going to work on. One of the things we're kind of trying to build into the principles of the schools program we're creating is that children are able to get stuck in on projects, but not be scared of making mistakes and the project going wrong. But don't worry if the tomatoes don't grow properly.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the effort which is where you learn.
But again, that's the point, right? In fact, the moment the tomatoes don't grow is the point at which you're going to learn something profound. We've got to recalibrate that in our education system too, because what we do at a far too early age for most of our kids is teach them that getting stuff wrong is a sign of weakness or failure, where actually the universal truth is you learn nothing new by getting something right. You only ever learn something new from the point of a mistake or the realization you don't know something or you can't do something. And, again, I think it's so tragic that over the last decade and a bit, things like project-based learning have been demonized by people in really significant positions of authority or power, mostly for political motive and purpose. But actually, project-based learning is a vital part of the palette of a young person's development. And I speak from a position as a former school leader who used project-based learning as a major lever in the transformation of our school's fortunes when I was a school principal. And actually, the point was that by using project-based learning as a major part of our palette of what we did, our kids' academic results doubled inside of 2 years. So again, I don't talk from a theoretical or ideological standpoint. I talk from a point of lived experience. When sometimes you hear people like me talk about project-based learning, we get cast off as demons or enemies of promise or hope, or, we're trying to kill children's futures. But actually, I care as much as anybody else about every child getting the opportunity to thrive and live the best life they possibly can, academically, intellectually, spiritually, socially, in terms of their community and civic, all of it.
Can I dig into something on that? Sorry,
no, Morgan, go on. Yeah.
On the project-based learning side of it, and I'd just really like to get into the kind of what change is happening within the child. So when you're a teacher in that scenario and you're working with a group of young people on a project, maybe over like a term or over a year, say it could be a school garden, but it could be a number of other things as well. One of the things we would love children to do more is we want them to get stuck in and get their hands dirty and stuff and do stuff, because that's great and it kind of feels like something's happening, and that's really important for their kind of well-being and kind of helps to lower their eco-anxiety and stuff a little bit because they feel something's actually happening. But we do definitely want them to also, when they're putting the tools away at the end, to have 5 minutes to reflect and think, right, what's actually changed here for me inside me. So I'd really like to know, as a teacher, when you're in that role of kind of coaching that group, what are you kind of trying to do kind of in terms of their development and the kind of attributes and skills and values and stuff that should be developed? I'd love to dig into that now.
I think for me, the really important thing is the connectedness. It's almost like that practical work, that opportunity to get stuck into a project is a bit like meditation, right? Because kids are leading these incredibly busy lives. They're being fired with information and facts and knowledge about literacy and numeracy and science and history and geography and blah, blah, blah. And actually where they get their hands dirty, where it gets physical, where it gets experiential, is the time where all of that stuff can settle. And also it allows the brain chance to connect those things together. So suddenly they don't feel like, disparate and abstract chunks of knowledge or information, and actually they start to come together. And because a child is applying so many of those things, often subconsciously by being engaged in a project, those things are settling, they're embedding, they're becoming fixed and important in that child's skills and memory bank. And so, for me as a teacher, those were always the most important things, because you have to take away the abstract of what you're teaching. And the way you do that is making it pragmatic. There is no accident that, and I don't know how you percentage it, but I remember being captured by it as a student myself when I was training to be a teacher. But the sentiment's right. We learn somewhere between 70 and 75% of everything we learn in our lives before we're 5. Now, I'm not talking about the accumulated experiences, but if you think about it for a minute, most of us learn to walk and talk, to understand vocal intonation, facial expression, body language. We learn to make sensory sense of the world around. All of that happens during those first 5 years of life, right? And why is that? Because so much of that is pragmatic. We learn something, we pick it up, we apply it, we play with it, we develop it. And that really, for me, is what great project-based learning should be about. It should be an opportunity for young people to do exactly the same thing. So we take the learning out of the abstract into the workable. And in a way, it creates a really sustainable and powerful model of what learning should be.
Brilliant. Thanks. Yeah. It's definitely what resonates with me, and I used to love it in school whenever we used to do any sort of project, and out of school as well. It was always great, and actually I'm lucky that both my parents are teachers, so I've always been educated, probably without even realising it.
Yeah, it's in the DNA, you know.
Yeah.
Fact, right? Your DNA has changed without you knowing.
Yes. Bro, so I wanted to kind of if we can, sort of try and drill down to I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 5 different ways in which teachers and parents probably as well, or anybody working with young people who are looking to try and close this values perception gap, trying to create this kind of sense that we're united in compassion and that we have similar values around care, kind of practical ways in which that can be done with children, either at a one-to-one basis or kind of as a school culture or with a group. I was just wondering if you have any kind of top tips for us on how you can go about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing for me around the promotion of compassion is all our adult role models, teachers, teaching assistants, people working in schools, parents, should be confident enough to show their own humanity, their own fragility, their own reality. Because all too often, I think children see almost an artificial version of the adults around them. As parents, we're always trying to be stoic and brave around our kids. As teachers, we're always trying to look unflappable and in control and all-knowing. And actually that creates, if you like, a perception of the gap anyway, because children think, well, you know, I could never be them. I could never be as eloquent or together or intelligent, and so that's where some of that gap starts. So never be scared of being human, of showing your frailty, of your humanity, right? Secondly, we have to find a way to put current affairs back on the agenda in our schools. We have to give children space and time in a school environment where they can talk about the things in the world that worry them, that interest them, that ignite their passions, and help them to make sense of those things. Because again, I think sadly all too often in many children's lived experience at home, lives are so busy it doesn't happen anymore. A lot of people don't have a newspaper lying around anymore. Kids don't get the chance to talk about these things in school. They're exposed to it through social media and digital technology, but they don't really get a chance to talk. So we've got to find a way to bring current affairs back into schools. And on that basis, I also think, you know, a couple of other things we need to do in schools, actually. We need to create opportunities for proper debate. We need to teach children how to debate constructively with one another. Because again, I think it's one of those skills that sadly has been jettisoned too often, that we're not demonstrating and showing young people how to find, you know, we talked at the beginning about how to come back to those fragments of agreement, right? And nuance. And I think that can only happen through helping demonstrate that for young people. So that's got to happen. And I think finally, the other thing we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we don't assume, and I think this has come into massive focus during COVID, that all children share equal lived experiences. And actually that some of that compassion values gap can come from kids not understanding where other kids are coming from because they've never had the opportunity to experience those things. So again, for me, we have to make sure as schools we have a real commitment to broadening our young people's horizons and experiences. And that's lived experiences. So we've got to get them out there. We've got to give them access to the kinds of things that we take for granted in other children, museums, the arts, walking book in Nature, all of those things. And we have to make sure that we find a way of committing as an education system to ensuring all our kids are exposed to all of those opportunities. The broader the experience, the more likely the young people are to have an emotional connection to the issues that we want them to find and feel are important.
That was brilliant. I think your point on the debates and learning how to debate, I think, is a really interesting and useful one to think about, because, like we were saying at the beginning, there's the kind of, what is the purpose of a debate? And some people will go into a debate saying the purpose of this debate is for me to look the best at the end and to win the argument, which is, the kind of the negative way of approaching it. And the other people will go to it and think, right, the reason why we're having this debate is so that we can challenge each other's ideas in a constructive way and come to a good end point, which might not be the one which I was arguing for. But it doesn't matter because we got to a good end point. And even just that, isn't it? Just how do we get from that kind of confrontational, kind of competitive kind of atmosphere to a more, through this discussion, through this collaboration, through this cooperation, we can actually create something new and better.
And if we're to fight one of the greatest dangers on humanity moving forward over the next few decades, which is this polarization, and use of fake news and truths and all the rest of it, then we have to put that ability to debate constructively in order to find common platform, common purpose, and a common way forward at the heart of everything we do. Otherwise, that polarization is just going to continue to exacerbate, and people will weaponize the passions people have for things. And that's really deadly. We've seen it happen over the last 4 or 5 years, specifically around the environment, I think, where people have weaponized the environment. They've turned things like Black Lives Matter, the environment, into weapons. And actually that does nobody any good. And it certainly doesn't mean we're going to find solutions. So we have to re-educate young people about the purpose of debate, the purpose of argument as a way to find common ground and a common route forward, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things which has really influenced our work at GAP at the moment, and is working into the dirt is good stuff, is what Richard Gerver and others have been saying around kind of the true nature of human nature and our understanding of that. And it feeds into the values perception gap in that we have assumptions that everybody's competitive and wants to have a debate and win the argument, whereas actually what we really know is that people actually much prefer to be friendly. And he talks about, he's referring to a guy called Brian Hare and his wife Vanessa Woods have done lots of research about sort of evolution of different species and finding that it's survival of the friendliest, not survival of the fittest. And when you're working with anybody, but especially young people, and I think if the kind of your imagined human that you're designing something around, if you think of them as being this kind of competitive sort of animal that wants to win and wants to be the best, you interact with them in a different way and you educate them in a different way. But if you're understanding them to be more cooperative and kind and wanting to care and help, then it changes the whole dynamic. And I do worry that the education system is built around this idea of somebody who's kind of that competitive, and actually that school is about preparing for a competitive world. And actually the purpose of your education, I remember hearing this when I was in school, like the purpose of your education is to be able to survive in the adult world where it's really, really hard and everybody hates each other, and you gotta compete as hard as possible. Whereas what we're moving towards here, I think, with these discussions, is that we're moving towards actually, no, the world could be a lot more collaborative, and you could be an active sort of citizen in creating that more collaborative world so that we're not all competing with each other. But it's kind of that, as a school leader, I guess, it's kind of, what is your vision of the world that the child's moving into, and what's your responsibility as that leader in terms of what are you preparing them for? And I think that's maybe something that people struggle with a bit.
I think, it's absolutely true. And whether people like the conduct of organizations like Google around their tax affairs or not, one of the things that those sorts of organizations have put considerable time, effort, money, and research into is what makes them so successful. It doesn't happen accidentally. That continued growth of these behemoth organizations. And what's really clear when you look at the research that Google have done into what makes them, what makes their most successful teams, for example, the most successful teams within the organization, it's not about a spirit of competition at all. It's quite the opposite. You know, the number one factor that defines the most successful project teams at Google is creating cultures of psychological safety. Well, you cannot create cultures of psychological safety if you're in a hyper-competitive environment where you're actually trying to defeat and beat the people you're working with. And at the heart of collaboration is that spirit of psychological safety. And the reason I raise the Google issue is not because I want to get into a debate about who they are or what they are or whether they've done good for the world, but actually, you know, people like you and I could easily be batted off as soft liberals. The one thing we know about Google is they are not soft liberals, right? And if they're putting collaboration and a climate of psychological safety, the absolute core of what defines success for them, then you know there must be something in it. Because they wouldn't waste their time if they didn't think it had a real measurable value.
Yeah, for sure. I remember reading in one of Rory Sutherland's books, you know, the Ad Man. He was talking about how he had a really pessimistic view of human beings, that we're all just obsessed with status and image and all these things, and that's how we sell stuff to people. But then when you look at, like, I then went and had a look at, I can't remember who he works for, but I was looking at the jobs that were being advertised and the job descriptions for that company. And it was all about teamwork, collaboration. We need these people who are really compassionate and helpful with each other. And yet, to create the best adverts to appeal to the kind of what we call extrinsic values of self-interest value, it was really bizarre. It's like, it's kind of, he was saying internally we need everybody to be, as you described, like at Google, but externally it was more about, if we can make people feel insecure, then we can sell them more stuff. It was really interesting to see how that plays out.
And it is deadly. It is really dangerous now because we're breeding generations of young people. Again, this really speaks into the values perception gap. We're breeding generations of young people who are terrified they're not as good as the other kids are, and they're obsessed with their own personal status and not falling behind socially or in terms of fashion or the way they look or feel or what they have, and consumerism is consuming us, and you know what, we have to use education to recalibrate that, because they are not natural instincts. If they were, there wouldn't be mental health problems around it. The reason we're experiencing an explosion in mental health problems is because actually I think we're forcing human beings to live in a way which is alien to our DNA and the way human beings want to live. And I think it's that friction that we're seeing on a more intense and acute level all the time that is causing such depth of conflict in so many people around mental health, and particularly amongst our young people.
It's true. And it's why I'm thankful there's people like you who are challenging that and talking about these things and writing about them. So we'll wrap up. I just want to ask you kind of what's next for you, and you've written how many books now? 4 or 5? 4?
I'm on. Not. It's not a competition. I've written 4, and I'm currently writing my 5th. And actually, it's my first book for younger people. So I'm writing a book for sort of the 15 to 20 year old age bracket, and the working title is The Smarts, and it's basically all of the kind of skills, behaviors and outlooks that young people need in order to thrive, but are very often taken for granted in their education and development. So I'm hoping I can get it finished, B, the publishers like it enough to actually go ahead and publish it, and C, young people identify with it enough to actually make a difference.
Bro, I really look forward to that. I've really enjoyed reading your books. I've been dipping back into them around doing these events with you, which has been really fun to do, and talking to my parents about it as well. They were both, obviously, like I said, both teachers, so they will definitely have their say. And it's been fantastic, and really look forward to that. And you, do you have any idea when it might be out? I guess if you're still writing, it's going to be a while away.
My optimistic side is it'll be out after COVID's finished. That's all I'm going to say.
Brilliant. Well, we'll look forward to both those things happening.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much. Honestly, it's been such a privilege and honour to work with you, the team, and all the people that have been involved in the Dirt is Good project. I just hope that between us all and the people that have been involved, we can make a real difference. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. And yeah, it's great to have you involved, and hope you can continue to be as we go forward with it. We're just at the beginning. Bro, I'll end it there. Thanks so much, Richard.